My parents changed the lock of my inherited house and pressured me to sign it over. Then I found out my dad had forged documents to take control of the house before and used that against them in court. I need to get this off my chest and maybe get some perspective from people who aren't emotionally invested in my family drama. I'm 31, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had a relatively normal, if somewhat distant, relationship with my family. That all changed when my grandmother Patricia passed away in July. She was 84, had lived a full life, and her passing, while sad, wasn't unexpected. What was unexpected was what she left behind. Specifically, what she left to me. Growing up, I was always closer to my grandmother than anyone else in the family. While my older brother David, 33, was the golden child who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, I was the quiet one who spent weekends at Grandma Patricia's house, helping her with her garden, listening to her stories about the old days, and learning her secret recipes that she swore she'd never write down. David thought spending time with her was boring. He preferred hanging out with his friends, or as he got older, chasing whatever business scheme he was convinced would make him rich. My parents, Robert, 58, and Jennifer, 56, always treated my grandmother with a kind of polite distance. They'd visit on holidays, make the appropriate noises about her health, and then spend the rest of the visit on their phones or talking about David's latest venture. I remember one Thanksgiving when Grandma Patricia had spent days preparing this elaborate meal using recipes passed down from her mother, and my parents brought store-bought pies because they didn't want her to go to all that trouble. The look on her face still breaks my heart. When Grandma Patricia's health started declining 2 years ago, I was the one who drove her to doctor's appointments. I was the one who stayed overnight at the hospital during her surgeries. I was the one who moved into her guest room for 3 months when she couldn't manage alone. David visited twice during that entire period, both times asking if Grandma had mentioned anything about her will. My parents visited more frequently, but their visits always felt performative, like they were checking a box rather than actually caring. The house in question isn't just any house. It's a beautiful Victorian in one of the older neighborhoods of our city, built in 1898. It needs work, sure, but it's structurally sound and sits on almost an acre of land in an area where developers are desperately trying to buy up properties. Grandma Patricia lived there for 60 years. She raised my father and my Uncle Thomas there. Every corner of that house holds memories. When the will was read, I was shocked to learn she'd left the house to me. Not to my father, her son, not to be split between the grandchildren, to me specifically, along with a letter explaining that she wanted it to go to someone who would love it as much as she did. Someone who understood that houses aren't just investments, but homes where memories live. The rest of her estate, her savings, investments, and personal belongings, was divided among other family members. My parents received a substantial sum, probably around $200,000. David got $50,000, and her car, a nearly new Toyota Camry. Various cousins and my Uncle Thomas received smaller amounts, but the house, valued at approximately $450,000 in its current condition, came to me. The initial reaction was intense. My mother started crying, but not from grief, from anger. How could she do this to us? She kept saying. My father's face turned this alarming shade of purple. David immediately started shouting about how unfair it was, how he was the older grandchild, how he needed that house more than I did because he had business plans. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, my life has become a living hell. It started with phone calls. My mother would call me crying, saying how hurt she was, that Grandma Patricia obviously loved you more, and how could I do this to my own parents? When guilt didn't work, she switched to anger, screaming about how I had manipulated a sick old woman, how I had turned her against her own son. My father took a different approach. He called me into his office. He's an accountant and presented me with spreadsheets showing all the money he'd spent raising me, complete with inflation adjustments. The total came to $387,000. He suggested that since I'd received such a valuable asset from his mother, the least I could do was sign the house over to him to balance things out. David's approach was more direct. He showed up at my apartment at 11 p.m. one night, drunk, pounding on my door and screaming that I was a thief. My neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, David told them I had stolen his inheritance. Fortunately, the police weren't interested in a civil matter, but it was humiliating. Then came the manipulation tactics. My parents invited me to dinner, saying they wanted to apologize and move forward. Foolishly, I went. The entire evening was a coordinated attack. They'd invited David, my Aunt Karen, my dad's sister, and even my cousin Michelle. Everyone took turns explaining why I should do the right thing and give the house to my parents. When I refused, my mother stood up, pointed at me, and said, "You are no longer my son." My father added that I was cut off from the family until I came to my senses. But here's where it gets worse. Last week, I received a call from a real estate agent saying he was ready to list my house. I told him there must be some mistake. I hadn't contacted any agents. He insisted that Robert, my father, had called him, saying he was acting on my behalf since I was too emotional to handle the sale myself. I immediately called my father, who claimed it was a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to help. But then I found out from my neighbor at the house. I haven't moved in yet because I'm still living in my apartment that people had been coming by measuring the property, taking photos. One even tried to get inside claiming to be an appraiser I had hired. Yesterday was the breaking point. I received a letter from a lawyer claiming to represent David, stating that he was contesting the will on grounds of undue influence. The letter detailed how I had isolated our grandmother from the rest of the family and manipulated her into changing her will in my favor. None of it was true, but it was all written in such a way that it sounded plausible if you didn't know the real story. I'm exhausted. I haven't been sleeping. I've lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks. My work is suffering because I'm constantly dealing with this drama. Part of me wants to just give them the house to make it all stop. But another part of me, the part that remembers Grandma Patricia's face when she talked about her home, the part that knows she wanted me to have it for a reason, can't do that. I don't know what to do. I've started looking into lawyers, but they're expensive, and I'm worried about depleting my savings on legal fees. I feel so alone in this. The only family member who hasn't turned against me is my Uncle Thomas, my dad's younger brother, but he lives across the country, and I didn't want to drag him into this mess. Has anyone dealt with something similar? How do you handle family trying to steal an inheritance? Am I being selfish for keeping what was legally left to me? Should I just give in to keep the peace? I could really use some advice right now. Update 1 week later, I can't believe the response my original post received. Thank you to everyone who reached out with advice, support, and similar stories. It helped me realize I wasn't crazy and that I needed to stand my ground. But what's happened in the past week has been absolutely insane, and I need to share this update. The day after my post, I was sitting in my apartment going through the comments and making a list of lawyers to contact when my doorbell rang. It was my Uncle Thomas. He had flown in from Oregon without telling anyone. "Michael," he said, standing in my doorway with a suitcase. "I heard about what's happening. I'm here to help." It turns out that my cousin Michelle, who had been at that ambush dinner, felt guilty about what happened and called Thomas. She told him everything: the dinner, the threats, the lawyer's letter, all of it. Thomas had immediately booked a flight. We spent that evening going through everything. I showed him all the documentation, the threatening texts, the lawyer's letter, everything. Thomas listened quietly, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath. Finally, he sat down the papers and looked at me. "Your grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she knew what Robert was doing," he said. "Robert, not your father, not my brother, just Robert. Patricia knew exactly what she was doing when she left you that house. She told me as much last year." This was news to me. Thomas explained that my grandmother had called him last summer asking his opinion about her will. She told him she was planning to leave the house to me because I was the only one who truly loved it and wouldn't immediately sell it to developers. She was worried about exactly this scenario, the family turning on me. "Why didn't she tell anyone else?" I asked. "Would it have made a difference?" Thomas replied. "Robert has always been about money. Always. Even as kids, he'd sell anything that wasn't nailed down. Patricia knew that. She also knew that you were the only one who visited her because you wanted to, not because you were waiting for her to die." Thomas had brought more than just emotional support. He'd brought the name of his college roommate Christopher, who is now a senior partner at a law firm specializing in estate law. Thomas had already called him, and Christopher had agreed to take my case. The next morning, we met with Christopher at his office. He reviewed everything and immediately identified several issues with David's contest claim. First, the will had been properly executed with witnesses who could testify to my grandmother's mental state. Second, there was abundant evidence that I hadn't isolated her. Her medical record showed I was listed as her emergency contact by her own choice, and her doctors could testify that family members were never turned away from visits. But then Christopher asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Has anyone else been to the house recently? Anyone with a key?" I mentioned the people my neighbor had seen but said they hadn't gotten inside as far as I knew. Christopher suggested we go to the house immediately. What we found there was shocking. The locks had been changed. When we called a locksmith and finally got inside, we discovered that someone had been through everything. Documents were missing from my grandmother's desk. Photo albums were gone. Most disturbing, her personal papers, including what looked like might have been earlier versions of her will, were nowhere to be found. Christopher immediately called the police to report a break-in and potential theft. While we were waiting for them, my neighbor came over. She recognized Thomas and told us something crucial. She'd seen my parents at the house 3 days ago with a locksmith. They'd told her they were securing the property for the estate. The police took our report but said since my parents were family and the estate was still being settled, it was a gray area. Christopher disagreed. He said changing the locks on a property that had been legally willed to me constituted trespassing and potential theft. He advised me to change the locks again and install security cameras immediately. But the real bombshell came 2 days later. Christopher had done some digging and discovered something extraordinary. 3 weeks before my grandmother died, my father had tried to have her sign a power of attorney document giving him control over her affairs. The document had been submitted to her bank, but was rejected because the signature didn't match their records. "This is attempted fraud," Christopher said, showing me the documents he'd obtained through legal channels. "The signature on this POA looks nothing like your grandmother's actual signature." Furthermore, Christopher found that my father had tried to add himself to the deed of the house 5 months ago, claiming my grandmother had agreed to it. That had also been rejected when my grandmother herself called the county clerk's office to report that she had never authorized such a change. Thomas had been quiet during this meeting but finally spoke up. "I need to tell you something, Michael. This isn't the first time Robert has done something like this." He explained that 15 years ago when their Aunt Margaret was dying of cancer, Robert had somehow convinced her to sign over her savings bonds to him, claiming he would distribute them to the family. He never did. The family had been too grief-stricken to pursue it, and the amount wasn't worth destroying relationships over. But Thomas had never forgotten. "I should have stood up to him then," Thomas said. "I won't make that mistake again." Christopher laid out our strategy. First, we would respond to David's contest with evidence of my legitimate relationship with my grandmother and proof that she was of sound mind. Second, we would file charges for the break-in and theft at the house. Third, and this was the big one, we would countersue for attempted fraud regarding the forged documents. "They're not going to like this," I said, feeling sick at the thought of escalating things further. "No," Christopher agreed. "But they've already declared war on you. The only question is whether you're going to fight back or let them win." Yesterday, the papers were filed. Last night, I received 17 missed calls from my parents and 23 text messages ranging from, "How could you do this to your own family?" to "You'll regret this" to my mother's, "I wish you had never been born." But I also received a text from Thomas. "You're doing the right thing. Patricia would be proud. I've got your back." I'm scared about what comes next, but for the first time since this started, I don't feel alone. I'll update again when I know more. Update 2, 3 weeks later. The last 3 weeks have been some of the most stressful yet vindicating of my life. I'm writing this update from my grandmother's house, my house where I've been living for the past week. But let me back up and tell you everything that's happened. After we filed our response and counterclaims, my parents and David went absolutely nuclear. The text messages and calls escalated to the point where Christopher advised me to document everything, but not respond. My mother started calling my employer claiming I was mentally unstable and shouldn't be trusted with responsibility. Fortunately, my boss knows me well and recognized this as harassment. HR got involved and sent my parents a cease and desist letter. David took a different approach. He started a social media campaign, posting on Facebook about how I had stolen his inheritance and manipulated our dying grandmother. He created a whole narrative about how he was the loving grandson who had been cheated. The problem with his story: our cousin Michelle, the same one who had called Thomas, screenshotted everything and sent it to Christopher. She also provided something even more valuable: text messages from David from 2 years ago where he called our grandmother a burden and said he couldn't wait for her to die so he could get his money. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My grandmother's neighbor Sandra contacted Christopher. She had something she needed to share. It turns out my grandmother had given Sandra an envelope last year with instructions to give it to me if anything unusual happened after her death. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from my grandmother dated just 6 months ago. I'm going to share part of it here. "My dear Michael, if you're reading this, then I suspect your father and brother are causing you trouble about the house. I want you to know that leaving it to you was not a decision I made lightly. You are the only one who sees it as more than just property. You understand that homes have souls, that they hold our stories. Your father has tried 3 times to get me to sign papers I don't understand. He thinks I'm old and foolish, but I'm sharper than he knows. I've kept copies of everything he's tried, and they're in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 472. The key is taped under the drawer of my jewelry box. Never doubt that you deserve this house. You earned it not through manipulation, but through love. Every cup of tea we shared, every story you listened to, every time you chose to spend Saturday with me instead of with your friends, that was love, not calculation. Stand strong, my dear boy. You have more allies than you know. All my love, Grandma Patricia. We immediately went to the bank with the proper documentation. Inside the safety deposit box was a treasure trove of evidence. 3 different versions of POA documents with clearly forged signatures. Recording devices with conversations of my father pressuring her to change her will. Bank statements showing that my father had been withdrawing small amounts from her account using the debit card he wasn't supposed to have. And most damning, a letter from my father to David promising him the house once my father got control of it. Christopher's eyes lit up when he saw all of this. This changes everything, he said. We submitted all the new evidence to the court. Within 48 hours, my father was served with papers for elder financial abuse, fraud, and theft. The criminal prosecutor's office got involved. Suddenly, this wasn't just a civil matter anymore. The family imploded. My Aunt Karen called Thomas screaming about how he was destroying the family. Thomas calmly replied that Robert had destroyed the family years ago with his greed. This was just the consequences finally catching up. My mother tried one last emotional manipulation. She showed up at my apartment with tears streaming down her face, begging me to drop everything. She said my father was having chest pains from the stress that I was killing him. For a moment, I wavered. Then Thomas, who had been staying with me, stepped out from the kitchen. "Jennifer," he said quietly, "Robert's not having chest pains. I just saw him at this golf course yesterday. You need to stop this." She left without another word. Last week, everything came to a head. David's contest was thrown out with prejudice, meaning he can never refile. The judge called it frivolous and without merit. My father was formally charged with elder financial abuse and fraud. The prosecutor offered him a plea deal, full restitution of the money he stole, about $18,000, 2 years probation, and 200 hours of community service. If he doesn't take it, he's looking at potential jail time. But here's the part that really shocked me. During the investigation, it came out that my parents are in serious financial trouble. My father had been using the money he stole from my grandmother to cover his own debts. They're about to lose their house. David's various business ventures have all failed, and he owes money to some questionable people. They weren't just trying to steal my inheritance out of greed. They were desperate. Thomas helped me understand something important. Their financial problems aren't your responsibility, Michael. They made choices, bad choices, and now they have to live with them. Christopher managed to expedite the probate process given the circumstances. As of 5 days ago, the house is officially legally, irrevocably mine. I moved in 3 days ago. Thomas helped me change all the locks again and install a comprehensive security system. Yesterday, I was unpacking boxes in what used to be my grandmother's sitting room when I found another letter. This one tucked inside a book of poetry she loved. "Michael, make this house live again. Fill it with laughter and love. Have dinner parties in the dining room. Plant new flowers in the garden. Don't let it become a museum to the past. I'm counting on you to write new chapters in its story. Love, Grandma." So that's what I'm going to do. Final update, 3 months later. I wanted to give one final update to close out this chapter of my life and share where things stand now. It's been 3 months since I officially moved into the house, and so much has changed. Let me start with the legal situation. My father took the plea deal. He's serving his probation and has completed 50 of his 200 hours of community service at a local senior center, which feels ironically appropriate. He's also in court-mandated therapy, which, according to Thomas, might be the best thing that ever happened to him. The financial restitution was paid last month, not to me, but to my grandmother's estate. That money was distributed according to her will to various charities she supported, which is exactly what she would have wanted. My parents ended up selling their house to avoid foreclosure. They're now living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town. My mother sent me one last letter a month ago, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that things had gotten out of hand. She wrote that she was in therapy too, trying to understand why she put money before family. I haven't responded yet. I'm not ready. Maybe someday. David disappeared for a while. I heard through Michelle that he moved to Florida to stay with a friend and is working construction. Last week, out of the blue, I received a text from him. I was an idiot. Grandma made the right choice. The house looks good. You're taking care of it like she would want. I drove by and saw him parked outside just looking at the house. We made eye contact. He nodded, and then he drove away. That might be as close to an apology as I'll ever get from him. And honestly, I'll take it. But let me tell you about the good things because there have been so many. Thomas stayed for a month to help me get settled. We worked together to restore the garden to how Grandma Patricia had it. We found her old garden journals and replanted everything exactly as she'd had it. The roses by the front, walked the herb garden by the kitchen door, the flowering dogwood she'd planted the year I was born. Thomas told me stories about growing up in this house that I'd never heard before. Stories about my grandmother as a young mother, about my grandfather who died before I was born. You know, Thomas said one evening as we sat on the back porch, your grandmother always saw something special in you. Even when you were little, she'd say you had an old soul, that you understood things other kids didn't. Like what I asked. Like the importance of stories, the value of listening, the difference between a house and a home. Thomas helped me understand something else, too. My father's obsession with money, his willingness to betray his own mother, didn't come from nowhere. Their father, my grandfather, had been the same way. Everything was transactional with him. Love had to be earned through achievement. Affection was conditional on success. My grandmother had spent years trying to undo that damage with her sons, but with my father, it never quite took. She never gave up on him, though, Thomas said. Even after everything he tried to pull, she still left him a substantial amount in her will. She hoped it would be enough. But some people, Michael, they have a hole inside them that no amount of money can fill. The house has become something of a gathering place for the family members who didn't side with my parents. Michelle comes over for Sunday dinners. Thomas visits every few months. Even some of my grandmother's elderly friends have started coming by for afternoon tea just like they used to when she was alive. I've also started dating someone, Ashley, a woman I met at the community garden where I volunteer. She loves the house and has helped me restore some of the original Victorian details that have been painted over or covered up through the years. We spent last weekend stripping paint off the original wood banister. And when we finished, we found my grandmother's initials carved into the wood along with a date from 1963. It was like finding a message from the past. Christopher. My lawyer has become a friend. He told me recently that in his 30 years of practice, he'd rarely seen such a clear-cut case of attempted elder abuse, but also rarely seen such a positive outcome. The evidence my grandmother left, the way she protected me even after death, was remarkable. Your grandmother was a smart woman, he said. She knew exactly what would happen and prepared for it. It's like she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. I've learned so much through this experience. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when things get hard. Thomas flew across the country to stand with me. Michelle risked her relationship with her own parents to tell the truth. Christopher took my case not just as a lawyer, but became personally invested in seeing justice done. I've also learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for toxic people is to let them face the consequences of their actions. My parents and David weren't evil people, but they let greed poison them. They made choices, and those choices had consequences. Protecting them from those consequences would have only enabled them to continue their behavior. But perhaps the most important thing I've learned is the value of standing your ground when you're in the right, even when it's family trying to push you around. Especially when it's family. My grandmother knew I would need strength to face what came after her death, and somehow her faith in me gave me that strength. Last week I was cleaning out the attic and found a box of Christmas decorations from the 1970s. Inside was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. For Michael, make Christmas magical in this house again. This December, for the first time in 3 years, the house will be fully decorated for Christmas. Thomas is flying in with his family. Michelle is bringing her parents who have apologized for their role in the ambush dinner. Some of my grandmother's friends are coming for Christmas Eve dinner. I'm going to use all her recipes, the ones she taught me over all those weekends together. I know my parents and David won't be there. That relationship might be broken beyond repair, and I've made peace with that. Sometimes protecting your peace means keeping certain people at a distance even if they're family. The house is no longer just my grandmother's house. It's becoming my home. But her presence is everywhere. In the creak of the third stair, in the way the morning light comes through the kitchen window, in the smell of her roses blooming in the garden. Sometimes I talk to her, tell her about my day, about the changes I'm making, about how I'm trying to honor her wishes to fill the house with life and love again. I think she'd be proud. To everyone who offered support and advice on my original post, thank you. You helped me realize I wasn't crazy, that I deserved to keep what was given to me, and that standing up to family bullies was the right thing to do. Your stories of similar situations helped me feel less alone. And to anyone going through something similar, document everything. Get a good lawyer. Don't let guilt make you give in to unreasonable demands. And remember that family isn't a license to abuse or manipulate. You deserve respect and fairness, even especially from the people who claim to love you. This will be my last update. The house is mine legally and emotionally. The family members who matter are still in my life. And for the first time in months, I'm at peace. Thank you for following my story. Take care of yourselves, Michael. P.S. Uncle Thomas just texted me. He's found an old photo album from the 1960s with pictures of the house when my grandparents first moved in. He's bringing it at Christmas so we can recreate some of the photos. He said Grandma Patricia would have loved that idea. I think he's right.